Examination, GS Paper 2, Governance, Constitution, Polity, Social Justice, and International Relations, features high-yield questions on the syllabus topic, important international institutions, agencies and fora, their structure, mandate. The Civil Services exam heavily tests how structural setups influence global decision-making, where they stall, and how India leverages or pushes for structural reforms within them. 10-mark, 150-word and 15-mark, 250-word variants, complete with structured model answers. Section A. Global Financial and Trade Institutions. Question 1. The World Bank and the IMF, collectively known as the Bretton Woods institutions, are the twin pillars of the global financial order. However, their asymmetric governance structures have led to a crisis of legitimacy. Critically analyze. 15 marks, 250 words, model structure and key points. Introduction. Briefly define both institutions. The IMF maintains global monetary stability and handles balance of payments (BOP) crises, while the World Bank focuses on long-term reconstruction and poverty alleviation. The core structural issue, asymmetric governance, quota and voting power. Voting rights are tied directly to capital subscriptions, quotas, which are based on historical economic weight. The U.S. holds roughly 16.5% of voting power in the IMF, effectively giving it a unilateral veto over major structural changes that require an 85% supermajority. The Gentleman's Agreement, by unwritten convention, the head of the World Bank is always an American citizen, while the managing director of the IMF is always a European. The crisis of legitimacy. Emerging markets like India and China generate a massive share of global GDP growth but power at the IMF. Structural adjustment programs, SAPs, historically imposed harsh austerity measures on developing nations. Explain that this structural rigidity has driven developing nations to establish alternative minilateral architectures, such as the New Development Bank, NDB, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, where voting power is distributed more equitably. Way forward. Conclusion. Summarize that for these legacy institutions to remain relevant, the IMF must accelerate its general quota reviews to accurately reflect contemporary economic realities, moving toward a democratic, rules-based multilateral financial architecture. Question 2. The World Trade Organization, WTO, is trapped in institutional paralysis, primarily due to the breakdown of its dispute settlement mechanism. Examine this statement keeping India's critical interests in mind. 10 marks, 150 words, model structure and key points. Introduction. State the core mandate of the WTO, to manage and promote free, rules-based international trade. It operates on a consensus-based decision-making structure. The structural breakdown. The WTO's appellate body, the highest court for global trade disputes, has been non-functional due to the deliberate blocking of member appointments to its 7-member bench. Without an active appellate body, countries can simply appeal any adverse panel ruling into the void, rendering the enforcement of trade rules toothless. Impact on India's interests. Food security. India faces persistent pressure regarding its minimum support price, MSP, programs and public stockholding of food grains under the Amber Box subsidy limits. Without a functional dispute mechanism or a permanent solution to the peace clause, India's domestic food safety net remains vulnerable to unilateral trade sanctions. Asymmetry. Developing nations lack the economic leverage to enforce fair trade rules through retaliatory tariffs without an independent, multilateral umpire. Conclusion. India must collaborate with like-minded coalitions, such as the G33, to push for the structural restoration of the appellate body while leveraging temporary interim arbitration mechanisms. Section B. Global Security and Political Frameworks. Question 3. The structural composition of the United Nations Security Council, UNSC, reflects the geopolitical realities of 1945, not 2026. Discuss the impediments India faces in its pursuit of a permanent seat in the UNSC. 15 marks, 250 words, model structure and key points. Introduction. Highlight the UNSC's structural split. 5 permanent veto-wielding members, P5, and 10 non-permanent members elected for 2-year terms. This architecture completely excludes regions like Africa and Latin America from permanent representation and underrepresents Asia. Impediments to India's permanent membership. The veto bottleneck. Article 108. Any amendment to the UN Charter requires approval and ratification by 2/3 of the UN General Assembly, plus the unanimous consent of all P5 members. The Coffee Club, uniting for consensus, regional rivals, including Pakistan, Italy, and Mexico, actively oppose expanding permanent seats, advocating instead for an increase only in non-permanent, rotating seats. China's strategic stance. While other P5 nations have explicitly supported India's bid at various times, China leverages procedural delays and ties its backing to conditions designed to stall progress. India's strategic countermeasures. India works through coalitions like the G4, India, Japan, Germany, Brazil, to demand a comprehensive expansion of both permanent and non-permanent categories. It builds deep ties with the L.69 group, developing countries from Africa, Latin America, and the Pacific, by positioning itself as the authentic voice of the Global South. Conclusion: a UNSC that fails to reform risks seeing its security mandate bypassed by smaller regional groupings. Realigning its structure is vital to restoring the UN's institutional credibility. Section C. Regional and emerging groupings. Question 4. Compare and contrast the structural and functional attributes of BIMSTEC and SAARC. Why has India systematically shifted its strategic focus from the latter to the former? 15 marks, 250 words, model structure and key points. Introduction. Both are crucial regional organizations in India's neighborhood, but they operate on fundamentally different structural dynamics. Structural and functional comparison. Attribute. SAARC, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, BIMSTEC, Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation, geographic focus. Purely South Asian landmass. Connects South Asia with Southeast Asia via the Bay of Bengal Rim. Structural hurdle. Dominated by the bilateral friction between India and Pakistan, features an absolute veto where a single member can stall any initiative. Operates on sector-driven cooperation without deep-seated, systemic bilateral rivalries. Key directives. Primarily aimed at regional economic integration, e.g., SAFTA, though progress has largely stalled. Functions as a bridge to ASEAN, directly aligning with India's Act East policy. Reasons for India's strategic shift. Security gridlock. Persistent cross-border terrorism has paralyzed SAARC's consensus-driven model, rendering summits impossible to hold effectively. Connectivity and progress. BIMSTEC allows India to bypass geographical and political bottlenecks to advance critical infrastructure projects, such as the Caledon Multimodal Transit Transport Project and the India-Myanmar-Thailand Trilateral Highway. Conclusion. While SAARC remains bound by its structural limitations, BIMSTEC provides India with a functional alternative to foster regional integration, secure the Bay of Bengal maritime zone, and fulfill its neighborhood foreign policy goals.